Recently, an organic tea company named Honest Tea conducted a series of social experiments. In several U.S. cities, they set up kiosks where people could purchase their tea on the honor system. They provided a clear plastic box where people could leave their money if they decided to purchase the tea. No one was available to ensure that people paid for the tea. A hidden camera recorded whether or not the people paid for the tea. The obvious point of the experiment was to see if people would act honestly and pay for the tea even when no one was available to supervise them. A link to an article about the experiment can be found in the underbar. Here are the results. Boston was the most honest city, scoring a 93.3 honesty rate. Washington, D.C. scored a 93% honesty rate. San Francisco scored a 91% honesty rate. New York City scored an 89% honesty rate, and so on, with Los Angeles scoring the lowest honesty rate at 75%. Now, are you surprised by the results? If we could just bracket all the leftover accretions of the mostly theological conceptual scheme about inherent human depravity and simply ask ourselves what we would do at the Honest Tea kiosk, and then make the reasonable conjecture that most people in similar circumstances would act just like us, then I suspect most of us wouldn't be surprised by these results. We also wouldn't steal the tea. We would pay for it. The results of the experiment would not be surprising to us. If anything, the results would be predictable. In LudditeRomantic's video in defense of democracy, he takes what he calls a pessimistic view of human nature and uses that view to provide a defense of democracy. A link to his video can be found in the underbar. According to LudditeRomantic, democracy is a process of sublimated war. He sees human beings as naturally antagonistic, and pluralistic democracy as providing human beings with an outlet for their antagonisms. Democracy diffuses hostility, so much so that parliamentary systems can be seen as mechanisms by which human beings renounce killing one another and agree to accept the will of the majority. Now, this view turns on what LudditeRomantic calls a pessimistic view of man. I take his view as being equivalent to, or mostly equivalent to, a pessimistic view of human nature. If I am wrong to make that equivalence, then I hope LudditeRomantic will show me how I've gotten him wrong. In any case, what I say about a pessimistic view of human nature can apply to a pessimistic view of man as well. Now, what I don't want to do in this video, because I plan to take it up in some future video, is to raise the question, what entitles or justifies someone's philosophical pessimism in general, and their philosophical pessimism about humanity or human nature in particular. Now, I realize that it has been vogue in intellectual circles since about the mid-1940s to blithely assume that all the evidence entitling and justifying pessimism is in and is uncontroversial, and the only questions that remain involve working out the implications of pessimism in various venues of life and experience. I hope to smash that intellectual icon in a future video because I think that the underlying presupposition that one can possibly assemble and vet all the evidence necessary to justify either philosophical pessimism or optimism, is pure poppycock. Both philosophical pessimism and optimism assume too much to be taken seriously. What does LudditeRomantic assume? Apparently he assumes that human beings are naturally antagonistic, hostile, and that short of non-violent mechanisms like democratic debate to vent their innate aggressive tendencies, they would act violently toward one another. If pressed about evidence for his assumption, LudditeRomantic might proffer wars, massacres, and other acts of violence as evidence justifying his assumption. Of course, all this assumes that LudditeRomantic's evidence uncontroversially demonstrates that human beings are inherently antagonistic, that there aren't subtler and more comprehensive ways of describing the antagonisms and violence in his evidence that don't involve the sweeping conclusion that human beings are naturally antagonistic. Accordingly, all this also assumes that any evidence seemingly contrary to LudditeRomantic's assumption about humanity's so-called natural antagonism can't be taken at face value and must be understood in subtler and more comprehensive ways that are consonant with his assumption that human beings are innately antagonistic. By contrary evidence, I have in mind phenomena like humanitarian efforts, acts of charity, social and political progress, self-sacrifice for the well-being of others, cooperation, say, people paying for their tea on the honor system, and so on. One of the problems with the pessimism versus optimism fiction is that both sides can marshal evidence for their respective perspectives, but must ignore, attack, or revise the significance of the other side's evidence. Now that's the easy route to take. The difficult route is to consider and work out the significance of all the evidence, especially the apparently conflicting evidence. But if we allow the evidence to remain conflictual, that is, if we don't engage in any tendentious cherry-picking and revisionism of portions of the evidence, as both philosophical pessimists and optimists are wont to do, what does the apparently conflicting evidence tell us? It seems to me that it tells us that human beings have capacities for antagonism, indifference, and cooperation, for all of them, and that a variety of circumstances and influences often facilitate which of those capacities get actualized. Notice that once we talk in terms of a range of capacities to behave in a certain way, we no longer need to talk in terms of a spectral human nature or generalize about a human tendency to behave in a certain way. All the talk about human beings being inherently antagonistic or cooperative and evil or good is eliminated and is not necessary. Now, there are important implications from these results. One implication is that if it is true that various circumstances often influence which capacities get actualized in human beings, then instantiating those circumstances that reinforce the actualization of desirable capacities should, on the whole, result in their actualization. Unsurprisingly, therefore, societies that, relatively speaking, maximize both liberty and equality to a greater extent than other societies tend to have consequent less crime rates and social problems, and more pro-social behavior. Now, if all that is true, the extent to which democratic institutions facilitate desirable human capacities is the extent to which we should embrace democracy. Notice that we are not now embracing democracy as a way of tricking some seething innate human aggression into enacting in a pro-social manner. Rather, we are utilizing democracy to actualize the human potential to act in a pro-social manner. From here, we might go on to reasonably hypothesize that the more we democratize human institutions and structures, the more we are likely to actualize human potential to act in a pro-social manner. Therefore, in my view, we should democratize more of our institutions and structures, and always do so to the greatest extent possible. That particularly includes democratizing the workplace. I said we should engage in this democratization to the greatest extent possible. Now, what the greatest extent is entirely an empirical question, one that might be decided, if at all, on a trial and error basis. In any case, the greatest extent possible cannot be decided a priori, and I dare say it cannot be decided on the evidence we have at the present vantage point in history, since maximizing the greatest extent possible has never been a widespread agenda, for various historical reasons having to do with social control and elite power structures. Therefore, LudditeRomantic is incorrect when he seemingly excludes a priori the possibility of future successful stateless egalitarian societies based on a hypothesized innate human tendency and human beings for aggression. Thank you.